Now I'll be working on tooth number 13 and 14. I'll doing probing on the tooth number 14. Insert to the distal buccal line angle. Then I'll walk, pivot. Then I'll roll, record the number at the close space for the distal. Then I'll roll back out. Then I will walk to the medial line angle. Then I'll record the number once it hit the medial line angle. Then I will walk to the distal surface and pivot. Then roll, record the number at the close bay. Similar with to number 13, insert, walk, and roll, record the number, and walk back out. Then drop the handle, record the number at the distal line angle, medial line angle. Then I will pivot and walk to the medial surface and then pivot, record the number. Now I'll be doing explorings. First, I will select the correct working end. Terminal shank is parallel to the proximal surface. I will be working on tooth number 13. I will be moving my elbow up and down and going to the distal surface, pivot and roll, and then a vertical stroke. Then I remove the tip of my explorers, turn it halfway, then going to the mesial surface. And then I will be moving my elbow up and down, and then pivot roll. One is go to the proximal surface. I'm gonna do the vertical stroke. Similar with tooth number 14, starting from the distal buccal line angle, going to the distal surface, pivot and roll, and then a vertical stroke. And then I remove my instrument, turn it halfway, and then I'm gonna do a rocking movement to the mesial surface. Then pivot and roll. Then I'll activate a vertical stroke up and down. Now I'll be using a universal curette to working on 13 and 14. First, I'll select the correct working end. Then I'll be moving my elbow up and down, going to the mesial surface, pivot and roll. And then I'll activate a vertical stroke. Then I'm using a secondary blade for the distal surface. Then pivot and roll, going to the distal surface, and then activate vertical stroke. Then I'm using a primary blade for the mesial surface. At this point, my elbow is moving up and down. Pivot and roll to the mesial surface. Once it hit the proximal, I'll activate a vertical stroke. Then I'm using a secondary blade for the distal surface. So my elbow moving up and down, going to the distal surface, then activate a vertical stroke up and down. Sitting in the 9 o'clock positions, I'll doing the lingual surface up to number 13 and 14. First, I will be doing probing. I'll insert the tip to the distal line angle. Then I will walk and pivot to the distal surface. Then I will roll, record the number at the close bay, roll it back out. Then I will walk to the medial line angle. As I walk, I am bringing the handle of my instrument up. Once it hit the line angle, I will be pivoting and roll. Similar with tune number 14. Similar with tune number 13. I'll insert, then walk to the distal surface, then roll, record the number, then roll it back out, then walk to the medial line angle, then record the number, then pivot and roll, record the number. Now please select the correct working end. The terminal shank is parallel to the proximal surface. That means the working end is correct. Starting from the distal lingual line angle, I'm going to the distal surface, side to side, pivot, roll. And once it hit the proximal, I'm doing the vertical stroke up and down. Now I turn it halfway, starting from the distal lingual line angle to the mesial surface. My elbow is moving up and down to the mesial surface. And then pivot and roll. Pivot and roll. Once it hit the proximal surface, I'm doing the vertical stroke up and down. Similar with tooth number 14. Starting from distal lingual line angle to the distal surface, side to side, pivot and roll. And once it hit the proximal, I'm doing vertical stroke up and down. Then I turn instrument halfway, starting from distal lingual line angle to the medial surface. My elbow is moving up and down, going to the medial surface. And once it hit the mesial line angle, I'm doing pivot and roll. The rock, pivot and roll to the proximal surface. Then I'm doing vertical stroke up and down. Now I'll be using a universal curette to working on 13 and 14. Starting from the distal lingual line angle, going to the mesial surface, I'm using a primary blade. And I'm only use the tip of my instrument only. My elbow is moving up and down, going to the medial surface. And then pivot and roll. And once it hit the proximal surface, I'm doing a vertical stroke. Then I'm using a secondary blade for the distal surface, starting from the distal lingual line angle. Then pivot and roll. And then a vertical stroke once it hit the proximal surface. Similar with tooth number 14, starting from the distal lingual line angle to the mesial surface. My elbow moving up and down, going to the mesial surface, using a primary blade. So pivot and roll once it hit the mesial line angle. Pivot and roll, and then a vertical stroke once it hit the proximal surface. Then I'll turn my instrument, then using a secondary blade for the distal surface. So side to side, pivot and roll to the proximal surface, then a vertical stroke.